everyone. Welcome to Refining Your Offensive Pen Test Methodology. I really appreciate you coming to hear what I have to say today. And it is my hope that when you walk away from this talk today, you're able to take something tangible to add to your own methodology. So here's an outline of what this talk is going to look like today. We are going to go through different levels of methodologies based off of a pen tester's or security consultant's experience or time in the field. We're also going to look at some of the challenges that come up when you're trying to refine your methodology and how to overcome some of those challenges. So who am I? I am Chantel Sims. I am a mid-level career security consultant. I have a background in psychology and education. And I like to say that my background in psychology has had a heavy influence over my perspective as a pen tester or consultant. So before we dive into the different methodologies, I did want to point out some of where my experience lies, just so that you have a better understanding of where my perspective is coming from. So, methodology. Let's first agree on what a methodology is. It's a set of procedures or a set of rules, right? From a pen testing methodology perspective, we're talking about that checklist we might use when we're conducting an assessment, right? So, if we look in the top right hand corner here, the P test methodology, this is just one pen testing methodology. There are multiple ones out there. You got pre engagement, intelligence gathering, threat modeling, and so forth. This isn't necessarily a methodology that all pen testers or consultants abide by during an assessment, but it is an option. So, from my experience as a security consultant, if you look here on this scale, I do think that these are four key areas that have weighed heavily in an assessment. So, these are going to be the four key areas that we point on through each level. So, beginner's methodology. When you are a beginning pen tester, you are not necessarily given all the information that is out there possible. It's not possible though, anyway, right? We know that we learn over time and we learn as new exploits and vulnerabilities come out over time. So when we're looking at a beginner's methodology, we're looking at it from the perspective that they're not necessarily seeing the full landscape, right? I do want to say, just as an aside, we are going to use this house visual throughout the different methodologies for those visual learners. And we're also going to talk about tool usage and how you use that tool at those different levels of methodology. So when you're a beginner, you typically only see sort of like what's right there in your face. You're not necessarily seeing what's under the hood. So let's say that I say to a beginning pen tester, hey, you see this house here? That house is an application. I need you to go and break it or find your way in, right? And that beginner is probably only going to notice they're probably going to notice like the front and back doors or the windows and so forth. When it comes to their perspective of an attack surface, it's the same thing. They're only seeing what's common or right there in their face. So when it comes to their exploitation scalability, it's typically point and click like Metasploit. Not to say that Metasploit isn't used by advanced consultants, because it still comes in handy, right? But they're not necessarily taught right off the bat how to write an exploit or to take advantage of a vulnerability. When we're talking about communication and technical writing, typically when you start off, your writing isn't as polished and it typically doesn't go as in depth when talking about risk and impact. And that's not necessarily the fault of the pen tester, it's just because of their experience and where they are that day. So here's the house visual that I mentioned. So again, if I ask that beginning pen tester to look at this house, find a way in, they're probably going to use some of your like standard go-to tools, right? So you got GoBuster, Nikto, Nmap, and Nessus. So if we're looking at the house visual as an attack surface, the beginner is not going to see everything around the house. They're really only going to see what's right in front of them. So let's take the example of using Nmap as a beginner. When you're a beginner, you are typically shown how to run a TCP connect scan. For those that don't know what a TCP connect scan is, it's just completing the three-way handshake. It typically also is a little bit noisier on the client's end. So typically a beginner using Nmap isn't necessarily thinking about how it's going to show up on the client's end or if that matters at all. So, moving into intermediate methodology. From an intermediate standpoint, when it comes to enumerating, your perspective has expanded, right? You're able to look at that house and look at everything around it and start to really assess out what you should be testing for, right? So, when it comes to the perspective of the attack surface, you're seeing more, like I just stated. When it comes to your exploitation scalability, you're not only just doing point and click, this is when you start to move into some more manual testing and some script writing. Sometimes in different client environments, they ask that you don't use tools just so that you don't crash their environment or so that you're not so noisy. But manual testing is, it starts to get a little bit more tricky, I would say. When it comes to communication and technical writing from an intermediate standpoint, your writing starts to become a little bit more polished, a little bit more in depth. You're able to communicate the risk and the impact more thoroughly. So, right back to our house visual, right? So, if we have someone that's mid level career, which I put myself in, um, we're able to start to see, okay, we see this house, this application. I see they got the front and the back doors. Okay, I'm going to touch on that just like a beginner would. But I'm also going to start to look at the roof, look at the shingles on that roof, see the weather and how it impacts the house. We're going to start to look at that shed out back and so forth. Here's an example of intermediate tool usage, right? So when you're using a tool as someone that's mid-level career, you have a better perspective around clients' needs and a client's environment. So an example of this is an Nmap null scan, right? So a null scan simply just sends packets without TCP flags in them, and usually it's to try to get a firewall to respond to your scan. When you're a beginner, you're typically not touching on this type of scan. So advanced methodology. So from an advanced standpoint, I am going to give the perspective of the senior pen testers and consultants that I've worked with and things that I've learned from them, right? So, their ability to enumerate an environment, it typically starts to expand even more. They're more likely to see like the entire attack surface. Their exploitation scalability has moved beyond into like exploit development, and their communication and technical writing becomes very, very polished, and they're very in depth with the risk and impact analysis. So here's our house visual from an advanced methodology standpoint. If you put an advanced consultant or advanced pen tester right there in front of that house and say, hey, find your way in, they're going to start to look at the grass around it. You might see it might be blocked a little bit here, but there's a little man like shuffling through the grass, looking through the weeds, and so forth. And that's just not something that a beginner or sometimes intermediate doesn't necessarily do. So, from an advanced tool usage standpoint, one of the scans that I wanted to point out, the scanning method here is called a zombie scan. And this particular scanning method is essentially a blind TCP port scan. And what you're essentially doing is you're looking for a zombie host to gather information about other hosts in an internal network. And it typically makes it harder for intrusion detection systems to detect it and so forth. So, challenges. What I want to say before we go into some of these challenges, you're very likely thinking that the challenges are very technical. They're not necessarily technical. When it comes to improving your skill set, let's be very clear that it does have more to do with the emotional aspect rather than intellectual. And this is one of my favorite quotes here: "The major barrier to skill acquisition isn't intellectual; it's emotional." So, the first one here, imposter syndrome. Everybody hears about imposter syndrome. everybody should know what it is at this standpoint. You feel like you don't belong, right? Especially in the pen test world, because there's just so many things that you could be doing, right? Something I wanted to point out when it comes to imposter syndrome, it does create more stress for you over time. And it does have neuroscience like implications. So I wanted to point one thing out here that I found from a research article around imposter syndrome and stress. So the constant fear of being found out as a fraud, it typically results in everyday anxiety, and it often results in higher levels of the cortisol in the individual's brain and body, which impacts your work performance, your productivity, and your health. So I think that says a lot about how imposter syndrome can really become a barrier that like overtakes you physically. When it comes to the fear of failure, I'm pretty sure everyone is in this category. I have not met a pen tester or consultant yet that doesn't have a fear of failure in some regard. It may weigh heavily for one person or whatever, but it's typically there. I can say personally, with this particular barrier, I have always had issues like from a Black woman's standpoint. Like a lot of people in the field don't necessarily look like me. So sometimes when I'm in the room or I'm in a meeting going over things with a client or so, I know that I stand out in some regards. So a lot of times for me, I think to myself, okay, I need to make sure I am absolutely right. No slip ups come out throughout my mouth and so forth. So I put a lot of pressure on myself, right? But again, that like creates more stress in my body physically. And what I've had to do to sort of overcome this particular state of mind is to constantly remind myself that no one knows it all, right? If somebody tells you from a pen testing standpoint that they know everything, they're lying because the landscape is constantly changing, right? There's constant 0 days coming out, vulnerabilities, different exploits being written for those vulnerabilities. It's constantly changing, and you have to keep up with those, which is just part of the field, part of being in the field. So while I will say that I have overcome this in a lot of ways, it still peaks up from time to time. And that's okay. I think that's to be expected, to be quite honest. Perfectionism. So I kind of touched on this with, that fear of failure, being in front of a client and not wanting any slip ups, wanting it to be absolutely perfect. But what I have found with perfectionism is that it actually messes me up more than if I just sort of relax and take my time and even have some mistakes in there. Perfectionism actually messes with me more. So, what I've had to do with this as well is sort of that same mental note that we don't all know everything, right? It is all based off of our experience. It's based off of what I do when I get home from work. It is based off of, yeah, it's based off of a lot of different variables. So, overcoming perfectionism, this is a tough one as well, but it's possible. It's absolutely possible. And barrier number 4. So, comparison to others. I think this may be the number one thing that, the number one barrier that we all come up against. When we're talking about comparison to others, there's always this sort of feeling that comes with like, oh, I'm so behind. This person just got this advanced cert. They just got this advanced cert, and so forth. And I could say that with the layoffs that have been happening in tech, I'm sure that this particular mental barrier has come up for even more people because now they're up against hundreds or thousands of other pen testers, vying for that job. And you're constantly looking over your shoulder and wondering like, oh, okay, I need to do this. Am I going to be able to get there? Am I good enough? And so forth. This right here is something that I dealt with a lot, a lot, a lot, a lot. I would look at certain hackers, like their resumes. I would look at what they got certification wise. I would look at what they did security research wise. And I was always constantly comparing myself to them, thinking that their way, their methodology to getting those certifications and so forth, that was the only way I was going to get on top. But it's not. It's just not. So let's talk about overcoming these barriers, right? I told you how I've experienced those barriers myself. So when it comes to actually overcoming them, to change yourself effectively, you have to first change your perception, right? And so I wanted to point out what it actually takes to become really good at something you love, right? So it takes 20 hours typically to learn something new. When you think about it overall, 20 hours is not that long. That takes almost 3 hours a day in a week, or 40 minutes a day for a month if you really commit yourself to it. But we all have lives, right? We're not just here just for work. We aren't just our work. We have families. We have, I don't know, events. We want to go spend time with our family, spend time with our friends, and so forth. So we can't necessarily just commit to those 40 minutes a day for a month, especially if you have kids. I have kids, can't say I could do that. But I do believe that I could do that over time. So to become an expert, and this is one that does fascinate me a lot. It takes 10,000 hours to become an expert, right? Especially in a narrow field and something as specific like pen testing. But 10,000 hours, that's a number of years. And that depends on the number of hours that you're dedicating. Again, if you have a life, if you have kids, not saying that you don't have a life if you don't have kids, but if you have kids, you have people you have to take care of in your family, and you're working on your own self care and so forth, you don't necessarily have that time. But that time has to be spread out over time. So you're going to see, you see right here, I have like a therapy session in self care. Like I said, you probably came looking at the challenges we went through and thinking to yourself, oh, it's only technical challenges. No, again, remember the challenges to a skill acquisition is always emotional. It is not intellectual whatsoever. It doesn't say anything about your intellect and how smart you are or how not smart you are. What it really comes down to is taking care of your mental, taking care of your physical. And sometimes that might mean going to therapy. Like, there's literally nothing wrong with therapy. I know in some communities it might still be a stigma. At least in my community, family community here, it is not a stigma. Like, we all go to therapy. If anything, if I meet someone that doesn't have a therapist, I'm usually like really shocked. Like, oh my God, you're very strong to just be out here living life without help, right? But therapy can really help you work through a lot of your anxieties. I have like met some people during my time in security where a lot of pressure has come from their family because they have to help take care of their families. And when they're having to help take care of their families, there could be an increased anxiety around making sure they're training constantly, constantly, constantly. But that has an effect on you long term and sometimes in the short term as well. So seek out therapy. Sometimes, if you can't even get to a therapist, reach out to a friend, talk to a friend, and just take care of yourself. And I know it's easier said than done. It absolutely is. Like, I struggle from time to time, especially as a mom, taking care of myself. But I I eventually always come back to knowing that the second I start not taking care of myself, it starts to affect my mental. It starts to affect if I can even concentrate on learning some new technique and so forth, right? So, self care, therapy, talk about your feelings. It's not technical. You can learn the technical skills, but you first have to stick with taking care of yourself first. So, we have reached the end of this talk. And I wanted to lay out some of the takeaways that I hope you're able to take away from this talk. Your experiences gained through failure and success, it's going to shift your perception, right? So if you fail and you fail over and over and over again, it's going to shape your perception. You may allow it to shape your perception in a way to say, like, oh, I'm just not good enough for this, or, oh, I have found different ways that something doesn't work, right? And it really does have an impact on your perception of a client's attack surface, believe it or not. your self-perception, it does determine a lot, not all of them though. It doesn't determine all of your behaviors, but it does determine a lot. So if you see yourself having a growth mindset, knowing like, hey, I don't know everything, but I'm definitely gonna try, and I know I can get better at exploit writing, script writing, and so forth. I know I can do it. That's going to influence you to think more clearly or be able to even concentrate better when you are just learning something, right? When you're overcoming the emotional barriers to learning new skills, you have to realize that it takes like actual practical consistent work. And what I mean by that is that you have to actually like put it into action. You can't just say to yourself, oh, I have a growth mindset, and move on from there, right? No, you have to actually practice what you're going to say to yourself when you fail, what you're going to say to yourself if you didn't pass the latest certification exam. That is what begins to influence you, and is you're going to be better for it in the long term. And lastly, the last thing I want to point out, especially if you are in this pen testing area, red teaming, any of that, it's a marathon. It's really not a sprint. And if you think it's a sprint and you're viewing it as a sprint, you're going to fail. And you're especially going to fail with your self care. So you need to understand that when you're trying to gain new skills and so forth, it is only you versus you yesterday. I recently learned a new hacking technique, and it's a pretty cool one too, an Active Directory attack. But I was able to sit there with that and appreciate that I took the time to learn something new, and I'm not necessarily the same pen tester I was yesterday. That has a heavy influence on you. So I hope that you're able to take these things away and know that when you are trying to refine your own methodology, what comes first is self care, believe it or not. I know some people might not necessarily fully grasp it, but once you start to get into the thick of it, once you're trying to learn advanced concepts and stuff, you will notice that, you might get anxiety around things and so forth. But I really hope that you take away from this talk that your self-care comes first, especially as a pen tester or a red teamer. Thank you for coming to my talk. I really, really appreciate it. Again, thank you again for just coming to hear what I have to say. My talk may not be for everyone, but I hope that you are able to take what I've said today and apply it to your own methodology. And first step is self care. Thank you.